You think you know the monarchs who shaped Europe? Names like Henry VIII or Louis XIV come easily to the tongue, their reputations bound up with drama wives, wars and glory. But lurking in the shadowed corridors of history is another ruler less celebrated yet more disturbing in his private cruelties, Ferdinand II of Spain. To the public eye, he was the Catholic king architect of dynastic union, the man who with Queen Isabella completed the Reconquista and launched Columbus across the Atlantic. Yet behind the official portraits and church hymns stood a figure whose private world was built on domination paranoia and the systematic breaking of women's spirits. The mask of Ferdinand was polished daily in the grand courts of Christendom. He was painted as a defender of the faith, a careful statesman, a man who wove together the crowns of Aragon and Castile into a new Spanish identity. The papacy praised him. Nobles feared him. Poets wrote of him as a monarch touched by divine authority. And yet within the walls of his palaces, behind the tapestries that muffled whispers and footsteps, Ferdinand practiced a regime of control that turned his queens into prisoners and his marriage bed into something closer to a tribunal. To understand how such contradictions could coexist, one must step into the world of late medieval Spain. These were years marked by triumph and terror alike. 1492 was not only the year Granada fell, sealing the defeat of Muslim rule in Iberia, but also the year Jews were expelled under royal decree. Religion was not just belief, it was state policy. Marriage, too, was never a private bond of affection, but a public alliance, a contract of dynasties where fertility meant power and heirs meant survival. A queen was less a wife in her own right than a vessel of continuity, the living guarantee that God favoured the crown. In such a climate, intimacy was never merely intimacy. It was evidence, it was proof, it was the very machinery by which kingdoms were secured. The church sanctified royal unions, but also placed them under a microscope. Every bedchamber carried the weight of empire. To produce an heir was to secure borders, to fail was to invite invasion, rebellion, or dynastic collapse. And Ferdinand, paranoid by nature and ruthless in practice, elevated this anxiety into a system of surveillance that transformed private love into state ritual. Imagine being one of his young brides, arriving from some distant court, Portugal, Saxony, Naples, dreaming perhaps of jewels and processions, only to discover that the man you married saw you not as a partner, but as a piece of machinery in a dynastic workshop. From the outside, the palaces glittered with Moorish courtyards, with silken draperies, with carved wood ceilings that still catch the light today. But inside doors, locked from the outside, spies listened at keyholes, and marriage became performance under duress. Historians often remind us that the personal is political. In Ferdinand's case, the personal was weaponized as political. He did not simply inherit the medieval tradition of arranged marriage, he sharpened it into something crueler, colder, more mechanical. His reign demonstrates how the public mask of piety and order could hide a private world of calculated humiliation. If Isabella's legacy became one of saintly motherhood and national unity, Ferdinand's private legacy is one of suspicion so deep that he needed proof of obedience even in the moments meant for tenderness. This duality, saviour of Spain on the one hand, tormentor of queens on the other, is what makes his story so unsettling. It is easy to condemn tyrants who rule with open violence. It is harder and perhaps more frightening to face the rulers who wore sanctity like a crown while practicing cruelty in whispers and candlelight. Ferdinand II's life forces us to confront how power corrupts not only states and parliaments, but these most intimate bonds between human beings. The stage is set. We are about to step beyond the mask into the hidden rooms where his wives lived, not as queens of Spain, but as captives of one man's obsessions. What follows are not the tales of ballads or textbooks, but the rules of a royal marriage, turned nightmare rules so twisted that they would echo in palace gossip and frighten noble families for generations. Here the story begins. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe. Only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? The wedding night, supposedly the most private threshold of married life, was under Ferdinand's rule stripped of its intimacy and turned into a grotesque performance. To the young brides brought into his household, it was not a union but a trial, and as witnesses were not lovers' confidants but palace officials, physicians and political allies waiting outside the door. What should have been the beginning of trust became a spectacle stage for the state. Here is how it worked. Once Ferdinand retired with his new queen, attendants waited in silence, their ears pressed to the heavy doors. At dawn or sooner, if Ferdinand gave the signal, a team of officials burst in as though storming a crime scene. They rushed to the bed, their task not celebration but inspection. The sheets were examined for blood, the mattress checked for its signs of struggle, and the position of the linens noted in meticulous detail. These records were not private notes, but formal documents sometimes sealed with wax and stored in the palace archives. To Ferdinand, consummation was not a personal act. It was evidence that the contract of dynasty had been fulfilled. And if the evidence was lacking, the Queen was dragged before a panel of court physicians still trembling and bleeding to undergo a physical examination. Imagine the horror a teenage princess barely out of girlhood made to expose herself before strangers in a strange land, all because her husband's paranoia demanded proof. Her body was not her own. It was government property to be certified, stamped and filed like a treaty. This obsession was not uniquely Spanish. In France, the consummation of royal marriages had long been a public matter. Chroniclers describe how noblemen sometimes lingered outside bedchamber doors, eager to report whether groans or silences were heard. In England, Henry VIII's court also demanded evidence of fertility, though not with the same bureaucratic ferocity. Across Europe, the body of a queen was the testing ground of dynastic legitimacy, and virginity was as political as land or armies. But Ferdinand pushed this practice to a chilling extreme. Where other monarchs trusted rumour or gossip, he demanded written reports, signatures and witnesses, an empire of paper built upon humiliation. Worse still, Ferdinand sometimes invited favoured courtiers, not doctors, not clergy, but political allies, to peek into the chamber, granting them the grotesque honour of verifying the consummation. These men treated it as a twisted badge of loyalty, proof that they had seen what no subject should see. In one stroke, Ferdinand turned sex into surveillance and loyalty into voyeurism. The consequences rippled far beyond the bed. Noble families began to hesitate before sending their daughters into such marriages. Spain might offer wealth crowns and titles, but the cost was degradation. Letters from the time speak of whispered warnings, better exile than such a wedding night. Daughters of high-born houses wept at the prospect of being paraded like livestock, their honour reduced to stains on a sheet. To the brides themselves, the night was a theatre of terror. Consider the emotional landscape a young woman often married at 15 or 16, leaving her homeland forever surrounded by strangers and suddenly commanded to prove her worth before a panel of men with quills and candles. Every move, every cry, every signal parlance was interpreted as evidence. Even her pain became political currency. Modern historians have compared this ritual to an inquisition of the body. Just as the Inquisition sought confessions through relentless questioning, Ferdinand's bedroom court sought proof through relentless scrutiny. And just as heretics could never fully clear their names, a queen could never truly escape suspicion. Her body was marked, filed and remembered as either compliant or resistant, fertile or barren, loyal or treasonous. It is tempting to dismiss these stories as medieval exaggerations, yet the archival traces remain official notes, sealed reports, even references in diplomatic letters. This was not rumour. It was procedure repeated and institutionalized. What was supposed to be the consummation of marriage became the consummation of surveillance, the beginning of a lifetime where privacy ceased to exist. And so the bedroom was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage where queens were forced to perform, knowing the audience would always return. What began with humiliation on the wedding night would only deepen into daily torment. Ferdinand's palace was not simply a home of kings, it was a theatre of cruelty where love became evidence and intimacy became a crime scene. If the wedding night was meant to be the grand performance, then every night afterwards became a grim rehearsal of the same ritual. Ferdinand's paranoia did not end once a marriage was officially consummated. In fact, it deepened. For the rest of his queen's lives, the royal bedchamber was treated as a laboratory, each encounter subject to the same merciless scrutiny as the first. Intimacy was reduced to evidence and evidence to paperwork. After every visit Ferdinand made to his queen's chamber palace, officials arrived the following morning like investigators entering a sealed chamber of secrets. Their purpose was not celebration, but verification. They bent over the sheets with candles, examining stains, creases and folds as though charting the remnants of a crime. Nightgowns were inspected, undergarments sniffed, even pillows checked for proper disturbance. It was not enough for Ferdinand to know his marriage was active. He demanded written proof signed and witnessed as though the Queen's body were a legal document requiring endless countersignatures. The machinery behind this was astonishingly bureaucratic. Ferdinand assigned entire teams of servants whose only duty was to inspect bedding. They were not to fetch water or dress the Queen, but to act as archivists of intimacy. Reports were drawn up in meticulous detail: the colour of stains, the placement of tears, the exact timing of encounters. Some accounts even included notes on the attitude of the Queen, whether she seemed passive, resistant, or compliant. These reports were then added to official logs stacked among decrees and treaties in the same archives where Spain's wars and alliances were recorded. This level of documentation bears eerie resemblance to the record-keeping of the Inquisition, which was tightening its grip across Spain during Ferdinand's reign. Just as inquisitors catalogued the words of suspects with obsessive precision, every hesitation, every say, so too did Ferdinand's inspectors catalogue the whispers of bedsheets and bodies. Both systems shared the same logic: suspicion was constant confession or proof was mandatory, and absence of evidence was itself considered evidence of guilt. The effect on the queens was devastating. They never knew which nights would be subject to the heaviest inspections. A knock on the door at dawn could mean humiliation awaited. Many became so anxious they could barely eat or sleep, fearing that their bodies might fail to produce sufficient signs for the record. Servants wrote of queens pacing their chambers into the early hours, terrified of the morning. Their terror was not misplaced. If the inspection proved inconclusive, accusations followed swiftly of deceit, of negligence, even of deliberate sabotage of the king's line. The trauma extended to the palace staff as well. Imagine the young maid tasked with carrying soiled linens to the inspectors, knowing that a single missing stain could ruin a queen's reputation. Or the scribe forced to write down in cold ink the humiliating details of another human being's private suffering. These servants lived under constant tension, knowing that if Ferdinand ever suspected falsification, they too could face punishment or worse, execution. What should have been tender became clinical, and what was clinical became carceral. The queens were reduced to subjects of daily investigation, their most intimate moments logged with the same care as tax records. There was no reprieve, no sanctuary, no night truly free from surveillance. The bed, once a symbol of closeness, had been transformed into an interrogation chamber where even silence was evidence and absence of proof could condemn. This was Ferdinand's genius and cruelty combined. He transformed love into law and law into terror. Just as his kingdom was ruled by decrees and signatures, so too was his marriage ruled by the pen, the quill, and the wax seal. And for the women trapped in his world, every dawn brought not the promise of a new day, but the dread of another investigation waiting to be conducted on the cold sheets of their own beds. In most marriages, illness brings reprieve, a pause in expectation, a moment of compassion. But in the palaces of Ferdinand II, sickness offered no refuge. The king's appetite for proof, obedience, and heirs overrode human frailty. His queens, already prisoners of surveillance, discovered that even the failing of their bodies could not shield them from his demands. To Ferdinand, illness was not an ailment, but a trick, a conspiracy to deny him his rights. Medicine in this twisted logic became treason. Consider Maria Isabel of Portugal, Ferdinand's second wife. Contemporary accounts describe her as delicate, her health declining rapidly from what modern historians believe was tuberculosis. Her nights were marked by coughing fits so violent that blood stained her handkerchiefs, her chest so weak that climbing a flight of stairs left her gasping. For any other husband, such symptoms would inspire pity, perhaps even prayers for her recovery. For Ferdinand, they were excuses. The sicker she became, the more frequently he demanded her presence. To him, her illness was not a reason to relent, it was evidence she was shirking her duties as queen. Servants recorded the cruel paradox: the more Maria Isabel wasted away, the more her husband pressed her to endure. Worse still was the case of Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, his third wife, who was little more than a teenager when she entered the Spanish court. Barely 17, she suffered what physicians now believe may have been ovarian cancer, a condition that made even the lightest touch unbearable. To lie with Ferdinand was agony, yet refusal was impossible. When her cries reached through the walls, Ferdinand dismissed them as theatre, accusing her of feigning pain to avoid her royal obligations. He forced her to continue even when her body convulsed and she fainted from torment. In such moments one sees the true terror of Ferdinand's system. Queens were caught between the cruelty of their husband and the silence of their physicians. Doctors in his service were forbidden to intervene even when the women they treated hovered near death. Any medical opinion that contradicted the king's will, any suggestion that a queen was too weak for his demands, was branded treasonous interference. Physicians risked their own lives if they dared protect their patients. Some were threatened with dismissal, others with imprisonment, a few whispered to have disappeared entirely after crossing the line between truth and royal convenience. This climate of fear must be understood in its historical context. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were an age when medicine was fragile, half superstition and half observation. Physicians relied on humoral theory, believing illness stemmed from imbalances of blood bile and phlegm. Remedies were crude bleedings, purges, herbal concoctions. Pain was often dismissed as divine punishment or weakness of spirit. Against such a backdrop, Ferdinand's cruelty gained a kind of grotesque legitimacy. If suffering could be reinterpreted as laziness, then Queen's agony became evidence of disobedience rather than illness. The parallels to the Inquisition are striking. Just as inquisitors interpreted silence as proof of guilt, Ferdinand interpreted pain as proof of defiance. For the women under his control, there was no language of truth that could save them. To plead illness was to be accused of deceit. To suffer visibly was to be accused of rebellion. Even death itself was not an escape for queens who perished under Ferdinand's demands were remembered not as martyrs of cruelty but as women who failed to fulfill their sacred duties. Imagine the terror of lying in bed, fevered and trembling, knowing that the door might open at any moment and servants would be sent to carry you into the king's chamber. The chamber for a dying queen was not a sanctuary, but a courtroom where her pain was weighed not as human suffering, but as political evidence. Her body became both battlefield and exhibit, its decline recorded not in sympathy but in suspicion. It is in this world that the phrase medicine as treason finds its meaning. Doctors could not heal freely, queens could not rest, and sickness itself was weaponized as a form of control. Ferdinand turned illness into another chain of obedience, ensuring that no corner of his wives' lives, not even the fragile hours of suffering, was beyond his reach. In the court of Spain, compassion was treason, and silence was survival. There are scenes in Ferdinand's palaces that even the most hardened chroniclers recorded with unease. Picture a corridor cleared at midnight, torches guttering, servants ordered to make ready. 2 chamberlains lift a queen's skin hot with fever breath shallow, while a lady in waiting tries to steady her head. She pleads for a physician. The answer is the scrape of a key, the click of a lock, the hush that falls when every person present understands that mercy is not part of the ritual. The queen is carried across thresholds as though she were an offering. It is not a visit to her husband, it is a summons to duty delivered to a body that has nothing left to give. These were not rare events. In the worst periods, attendants learned the choreography lift from the shoulders and knees, turn the body away from the draught, place water and cloths within reach in case she faints. Some queens did faint, sliding into darkness from exhaustion or pain, and the servants following orders revived them with vinegar at the nostrils, with cold water, with whispered apologies they could never speak aloud. The goal was not comfort, but continuity. The scene must proceed. The ledger of service must receive its mark. Maria Isabel of Portugal had spells, when the coughing racked her so violently that crimson flecked her lips. To anyone else, such symptoms would have cried out for stillness. To Ferdinand, they were obstacles to be overcome by decree. As her strength ebbed, the orders intensified. She was lifted, arranged, revived, arranged again, the body as evidence presented and represented, until the night yielded the signs the bureaucracy demanded. What the sheets recorded, the archive kept. What the archive kept, the court could not contradict. For Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, the cruelty had an added edge: youth. 17 and already marked by pain that modern readers would name in the language of tumours and inflamed organs, she entered a ritual that granted no variance for agony. When the pain made her cry out, suspicion met the sound. When she flinched, defiance was inferred. She learned very quickly that to show suffering was to invite harsher scrutiny. In time, she mastered a royal skill that no tutor had intended to teach: stillness. She closed her eyes, slowed her breath, made herself a statue that could not betray itself until the body's limits defeated the mind's discipline and consciousness fled anyway. Then the women around her, maids older and not naive, brought her back with practiced efficiency. The night had to be completed, the paper had to be signed. This is how cruelty dresses itself in the uniform of duty. Ferdinand's defenders then and later claimed that a king's first obligation was to his crown and his country, that heirs were the bulwark against civil war, that the queen's suffering was a lesser evil than the chaos of a disputed succession. Pious language smoothed the edges. The queen, they said, shared in the sacrifice of sovereignty, a phrase that turned compulsion into liturgy. The bureaucrats who logged stains and times told themselves they were safeguarding Spain. The priests who stayed conveniently outside the door, ready with blessings after the fact, reminded themselves that marriage was sacred and obedience was virtue. Under the banner of necessity, A theatre of harm acquired its script. The pattern was not uniquely Spanish. In France, Catherine de' Medici's first decade of marriage to Henry II was haunted by childlessness. Remedies followed, that to modern ears sound like punishments, purgatives, poultices, syrups of doubtful provenance, astrologically timed regimens, consultations with learned men who spoke with absolute confidence and little proof. Catherine endured invasive procedures that blurred the line between treatment and trial, and she swallowed the humiliations because Europe had no place for a royal wife who could not conceive. Across the Alps and deep into Central Europe, Habsburg households elevated reproduction to statecraft. Piety demanded heirs, policy demanded sons. Courtiers charted cycles as carefully as armies charted marches, and women's bodies became maps others read for signs of deliverance or doom. Ferdinand's court simply stripped away the remaining veils. Where other courts pressured, his coerced. Where others prescribed, he compelled. He fused the worst of contemporary medicine, those frantic, untested interventions, with a machinery of surveillance that left no moment unmeasured. The Queen's bodies became laboratories, not in the hopeful sense of experiment, but in the carceral sense of inspection. Psychologically, the effect was corrosive and precise. Fear reshapes the mind's landscape. It narrows the horizon until only the next summons matters. Queens developed the symptoms that modern clinicians would recognize: hypervigilance at the sound of approaching steps, dissociation and interior dimming as if the mind stepped aside so the body could be used, suppression of appetite and sleep as if less of oneself might mean less pain to endure. Some displayed the paradoxical compliance familiar to those who study coercive control and a frantic eagerness to please, to anticipate orders, to eliminate any fault before it could be named. It is the logic of the trapped. If obedience cannot secure safety, perhaps more obedience might. The women around them, ladies, nurses, laundresses, bore their own kind of torment. To participate was to fracture. A maid who steadied a queen's shaking hands was the same maid who later carried the wet sheet to the inspectors. The mind protects itself with partitions, compassion occupied one, duty another. At night, those partitions sagged. Whispered prayers in antechambers were as much for the servants' souls as for the queen's bodies. And always the paperwork waited. The Inquisition had taught Spain the grammar of suspicion. Absence of proof becomes a category of proof. A denial is a likely sign of guilt. Suffering can indicate divine judgment, but it can also confirm rebellion. Ferdinand adopted the grammar and applied it to marriage. If a queen was too ill to rise, she was pretending. If she screamed, she was performing. If she fainted, she was dramatizing. Any reality that did not serve the crown's need was reinterpreted until it did. This is why the dying brides haunt the record. They reveal a system in which empathy is not merely inconvenient but threatening, because true empathy would force a reckoning with the cost of policy. Easier to call cruelty prudence, easier to call pain a test, easier to brand medicine treason, and make of doctors either accomplices or ghosts. The machine runs smoother when everyone agrees not to call it a machine. In time, the nobles noticed. Some began to resist offers of marriage alliances that led to Spain's inner rooms. The stories muted, hedged, half-swallowed travelled with ambassadors and dowry agents. They spoke of queens carried like invalids of doors that locked from the outside of blue-grey faces revived with vinegar so that a ritual could proceed to its conclusion. They spoke too of the silence afterward, the careful step of servants, the measured breath of a young woman who learned to lie perfectly still because movement might be read as revolt. When cruelty calls itself duty, resistance first takes the form of memory. A lady in waiting saves a scrap of letter that says too much. A laundress remembers a stain that never washed out. A scribe writes less than he is ordered to write. These are small gestures, but they are what remain when law and ritual have joined hands against the weak. The dying brides could not save themselves. But the truth of their suffering, stubborn and unglamorous, persists in the margins, in the notes, the rumours, the hesitations of men who otherwise wrote with black certainty. In those margins the mask slips. A kingdom is not strengthened by what was demanded of these women. It is indicted by it. The ledger that counted heirs also tabulated harms, whether or not anyone ever meant to add the columns together. And once you see the sum, you cannot pretend that what happened in those rooms was necessary. You can only call it what it was: a program of control that turned the sick into offerings, the private into public property, and the most intimate human threshold into a ritual of sanctioned harm. From the outside, the Queen's chambers glistened like the heart of a palace. Walls draped in brocade floors, softened with imported rug ceilings painted with saints and cherubs that seemed to hover in perpetual blessing. But for Ferdinand's wives, those same chambers were cages, ornate, perfumed but unyielding in their confinement. A queen might have worn silk, but the locks on her doors were forged from iron, and no gown could soften the reality that she was both monarch and prisoner. Ferdinand had special locks installed on the Queen's apartments, mechanisms designed so that the doors could only be opened from the outside. It meant that once a wife was inside, she belonged not to herself, but to the man who controlled the key. She could not walk in the palace gardens without permission, could not receive her own family, without written approval, could not even step into a chapel unless Ferdinand decreed it. What appeared to be royal privilege was in fact solitary confinement disguised with velvet curtains. The Queen's daily life became a theatre of supervision. Even her most routine interactions, requesting water, asking for fresh linens, were mediated by attendants who reported every word, every sigh, every complaint. Trusted ladies-in-waiting were replaced by Ferdinand's own spies, women planted in her household to act as silent observers. These women were skilled not in embroidery or courtly charm, but in listening, cataloguing, and reporting. In the quiet of night, while the Queen tried to confide in what seemed like a sympathetic ear, her words travelled down the corridors to the king himself. This system of isolation was not unique to Spain. Across the Mediterranean, the Ottoman sultans confined their wives and concubines within the gilded harem. There too, luxury masked captivity, courtyards filled with fountains, silk cushions, rooms painted with gold leaf, and yet the women were cut off from the outside world, their movements dictated by eunuchs and rival factions. In Tudor England, queens faced a different but equally suffocating system. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and others discovered that the court itself functioned as a labyrinth of surveillance. Letters were intercepted, servants interrogated, rumours weaponized. A Tudor queen might walk freely, but every step left her shadow in someone else's report. Ferdinand combined both models. Like the Ottomans, he confined his queens physically. Like the Tudors, he turned gossip and whisper into evidence. What resulted was a kind of double prison, stone walls without listening walls within. The paradox of their existence is striking. Queens were surrounded by luxury jewels in their coffers, musicians at their command meals, prepared with the finest spices from the Indies. Yet this abundance mocked them. What is a golden chalice worth when you cannot step outside to breathe the evening air? What comfort is a velvet bed when its sheets are inspected every morning by strangers? The very trappings of wealth served as a mask over the reality of their captivity. Servants too understood the paradox. They bowed before their mistress with the expected courtesies, but they knew she was no freer than they were. In whispers behind closed doors, they called her not your majesty, but the bird in the cage. Some wrote later in letters, careful not to name her, of the lady who watches the gardens from windows barred by courtesy. The psychological cost was immense. Cut off from friends, family, and even trusted confidants, queens began to retreat into silence. Some spoke only in the most formal phrases, fearing that any unguarded word might be repeated. Others turned to prayer, their rosaries worn thin by restless fingers. A few slipped into long stretches of muteness, days passing without a word, as though speech itself had become too dangerous to risk. Ferdinand's system of confinement transformed the Queen's chamber into a space of contradictions, dazzling to the outsider, suffocating to the inhabitant. Silk on the bed iron at the door. Courtiers admired the marble floors, while the Queen counted the hours by the tolling of distant bells, measuring freedom, not by what she could do, but by what she was forbidden. This was the genius of Ferdinand's cruelty. He made imprisonment look like privilege. To the world beyond, his wives lived in splendour. Within, they lived in solitude, stripped of choice, every movement shadowed by the watchful eyes. Their prison was built not of chains, but of silk and stone, a place where beauty itself became another layer of control. The Queen's greatest fear was not always the locked door or the morning inspections. It was the knowledge that every word she spoke, every sigh she uttered, every flicker of despair across her face might already belong to someone else. Ferdinand ensured it. He filled his wives' chambers not only with attendants, but with shadows, female spies whose loyalty was not to their mistress, but to the king himself. On the surface, they appeared as companions, ladies-in-waiting chosen for their refinement, their discretion, their ability to soothe a restless queen with songs or stories. In truth, their chief skill was observation. They sat quietly by embroidery frames, but their ears caught every whisper. They poured water into goblets while memorizing half-spoken sentences. At night, When the Queen thought herself safe enough to confide in them, those words travelled swiftly down the passageways to Ferdinand's secretaries. Reports were drawn, sealed, and sent to the king as if the Queen's private life were a matter of state intelligence. This system of surveillance blurred the line between household and prison. A queen could never know who served her and who betrayed her. Even trusted servants carried from her homeland were gradually replaced with Ferdinand's handpicked informants. Loyalty was severed thread by thread until isolation was complete. The women placed at her side became double mirrors, reflecting sympathy to the Queen while reflecting suspicion to the king. Their pattern echoed the broader climate of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella. This was the age of the Inquisition, when neighbours watched neighbours' confessors, weighed souls with suspicion, and even silence could be taken as guilt. Just as inquisitors built files of testimony on suspected heretics, Ferdinand built dossiers of private details about his wives. The nation itself lived under the shadow of surveillance. Why should the Queen be exempt? The irony was bitter. Queens exalted as symbols of dynastic purity and sanctity lived in constant fear that their most human reactions could be twisted into evidence against them. A sigh could be written as disobedience. A complaint of pain could be marked as resistance. Even a laugh at the wrong time might find its way into an official report. For the women tasked with spying, the role was double-edged. They were rewarded with the king's trust but despised by those they watched. Some played the part eagerly securing influence through betrayal. Others trapped in duty wept silently as they wrote down the anguished words of the very women they served. Yet all of them were bound in the same machinery, a culture that equated secrecy with danger and made betrayal into loyalty. What emerges is a picture chillingly modern. Ferdinand anticipated the tactics of later regimes that thrived on surveillance, Stalin's Russia, with its networks of informants, East Germany's Stasi, with its files on private citizens. But his experiment began not with the masses, but with the women closest to him. He weaponized intimacy, turning the Queen's household into a nest of suspicion, where trust was impossible. To live in such an environment was to lose even the sanctuary of thought. Words had weight, but so did expressions, pauses, and gestures. The Queen's body became a language others interpreted and reported. Privacy in the truest sense ceased to exist. The very walls of her chambers seemed to lean closer, as if even the plaster conspired to carry her secrets away. Thus the bedroom once imagined as a refuge became an interrogation chamber with no visible guards. Ferdinand did not need chains when he had whispers. He did not need dungeons when every sigh was catalogued. His queens, surrounded by silks and courtiers, lived inside a panopticon of betrayal, where every companion might be an informant, and every word a weapon turned back upon them. Today, psychologists have a phrase for what Ferdinand perfected centuries ago: coercive control. It is the systematic stripping away of freedom, the deliberate reshaping of a person's world until obedience feels like survival. Modern law recognizes it as a hallmark of abuse where the victim's choices, movements, and even emotions are manipulated so completely that resistance seems unthinkable. What is startling and chilling is how Ferdinand raised this private pathology to the level of royal policy. Every element of his marriages fit the blueprint. Coercive control begins with surveillance. Ferdinand ensured his queens were watched at all times by spies, by physicians, by inspectors of sheets and nightclothes. Their rooms were locked. Their letters censored their companions, chosen for loyalty not to them but to him. They were denied the most basic freedom, the ability to decide who to trust. Next comes isolation. In abusive households today, partners are cut off from family and friends. Ferdinand institutionalized this. Queens were severed from their natal families, their messages rewritten or suppressed, their visitors screened. Even the smallest act of independence, choosing whom to speak with, writing a private note, was forbidden. The world shrank until the only constant presence was Ferdinand himself. Then comes the control of the body. Abusers dictate clothing, diets, schedules. Ferdinand did the same. He monitored ovulation cycles, adjusted meals to maximize fertility, and demanded sexual availability regardless of illness or exhaustion. Pain was dismissed as deceit, refusal was branded treason, and the Queen's bodies became instruments of royal policy subject to inspection as though they were machines. Modern survivors of coercive control often describe the erosion of the self. Identity is chipped away until the victim thinks less of who they are and more of how not to provoke the abuser. Ferdinand's wives lived this daily. They silenced their own thoughts, spoke in rehearsed phrases, suppressed laughter, swallowed grief. Even their prayers were guarded for fear a muttered word might be reported. Slowly, the queens ceased to exist as women with inner lives. They became roles, performances, test subjects in a cruel experiment. What made Ferdinand's system extraordinary was its scale. This was not a single tyrant's whim hidden behind closed doors. It was bureaucratized, signed, sealed, recorded in the very archives of the Spanish crown. The same ink that ratified treaties of empire also catalogued the stains on a queen's bedsheets. The same scribes who chronicled Spain's victories at Granada logged the fainting spells of a sick bride. Abuse was elevated to paperwork, and paperwork elevated to permanence. If we step back, the parallels with modern regimes are stark. Totalitarian states rely on informants. Ferdinand planted spies in the Queen's bedchamber. Dictators used loyalty tests. Ferdinand devised humiliating availability trials for his wives. Governments censor letters and monitor private speech. Ferdinand read and rewrote his Queen's correspondence. In miniature, his marital policy foreshadowed the logic of surveillance states centuries before they emerged. And yet the cost was not abstract. It was borne in the trembling hands of women carried against their will, in the hollowed eyes of queens who stopped speaking, in the servants who woke at night from dreams of inspections and signatures. Coercive control, whether in a modern home or a Renaissance palace, leaves the same scars: the loss of self, the erosion of dignity, the collapse of trust in others. By turning coercive control into royal policy, Ferdinand blurred the boundary between statecraft and abuse. He taught his court, and perhaps himself, that domination was governance, that cruelty was duty, and that to own a crown was to own every soul beneath it. The tragedy is not only that his queen suffered, but that their suffering was legitimized by law, ritual, and tradition. Abuse became not a crime but a crown right. It is here that history confronts us most directly. The tactics we recognize today in stories of domestic violence were once written into the daily functioning of a monarchy. Ferdinand's court proves that coercive control need not be private. It can be scaled, sanctified, and made the foundation of empire. And in that recognition lies the most disturbing truth: monsters do not always roar from the throne. Sometimes they whisper from behind locked doors, their power disguised as duty, their cruelty recorded in the language of policy. If confinement and surveillance broke a queen's spirit by day, Ferdinand's most merciless demands shattered what remained by night absolute round-the-clock availability. His wives were not women to him, not companions, not partners in governance. They were instruments that could be summoned at any hour, their bodies expected to bend instantly to his command. To Ferdinand, the queen's existence was not her own, it was a function of his will. No clock dictated these summonses. They came at dusk, at midnight, at dawn, whenever Ferdinand's desire, suspicion, or paranoia stirred. Queens were expected to rise from sleep dress themselves swiftly and present a composed appearance no matter how ill or exhausted. Their attendants kept combs and gowns at the ready, knowing that the king might call without warning. A delay of minutes could be interpreted as defiance. A shadow of reluctance might be recorded as disloyalty. Ferdinand's obsession with control extended to biology itself. Palace records suggest he ordered his wives' menstrual cycles tracked, like military campaigns, each phase marked in hidden ledgers. Visits were timed to maximize the chance of conception, as if the human body could be scheduled like an army's march. Periods of bleeding were treated with suspicion, a natural rhythm reimagined as an excuse, even a deception to deny him access. In the logic of his court, a queen's most private functions were reduced to charts and calculations. The rituals surrounding this constant availability were humiliating by design. Servants were ordered to witness a queen's readiness, ensuring she had complied with his summons without protest. At times, Ferdinand deliberately called his wives during grief or sickness, exploiting their most vulnerable moments to test obedience. Imagine a queen mourning the loss of a child still wrapped in black veils, commanded to set aside sorrow and attend to the king's demands. The timing was not accidental, it was psychological warfare. These practices cannot be separated from the wider culture of late medieval Spain, where religion and superstition governed understandings of women's purity and duty. The church preached that a wife owed obedience in all things, her body consecrated to her husband, just as the soul was consecrated to God. Female suffering was often interpreted as holy sacrifice, a means of sanctification through endurance. Ferdinand wielded this theology as a weapon, cloaking his cruelty in the language of divine order. Superstition played its role as well. Beliefs about fertility held that a woman's disposition at the moment of conception could shape the child's character. Queens were thus expected to appear not merely compliant, but cheerful, as though joy itself were part of their duty to produce healthy heirs. A frown, a tear, a sigh could later be used to blame them for miscarriages or frail children. Their emotions became part of the evidence as closely monitored as their bodies. The psychological toll was immense. Servants recorded queens trembling when footsteps approached, unsure if they were about to be summoned. Some developed what modern medicine would call anxiety disorders, jumping at sudden noises, unable to rest. Others retreated into numbness, teaching themselves to show no expression at all, a mask of obedience to survive endless tests of loyalty. Perhaps the cruelest element was Ferdinand's deliberate use of impossibility. He would make contradictory demands, summoning a queen at night but criticizing her for appearing dishevelled, insisting on cheer while confronting her with grief just to measure how far she would bend. Queens who complied were rewarded with more humiliating trials. Those who faltered were punished with tighter surveillance, harsher isolation, or threats against their families. To Ferdinand, this was governance of the body elevated to governance of the soul. To his wives, it was an unending nightmare in which even sleep offered no escape. Their bodies were on call like soldiers at war, their lives orchestrated to the rhythm of a man's paranoia and a kingdom's obsession with heirs. And so the royal bedchamber, already stripped of intimacy and made into a stage, became something worse. A place where time itself belonged to the king, where a queen could never truly rest, and where every moment of her existence was measured against a single command: be available. Ferdinand's cruelty was never random. It followed a pattern, a design. If his queens were to be entirely controlled, it was not enough to lock their doors or monitor their bodies. He needed to break the spirit itself, and for that he relied on a strategy as old as tyranny: impossible tests. These trials were not announced, nor could they be prepared for. They arrived in the form of contradictory commands, timed to strike at a queen's weakest moments. Ferdinand might summon his wife at midnight only to criticize her for arriving too quickly, as if eagerness suggested impropriety. He demanded silence, then accused silence of being sulky disobedience. If she smiled, it could be read as mockery. If she wept, as weakness. There was no path to safety, only the shifting terrain of his suspicion. In military life, soldiers were sometimes subjected to loyalty tests where obedience had to be proven in the face of absurd or punishing orders. The Spanish Inquisition itself operated on a similar principle. Suspects were questioned endlessly, their denials used against them, their confessions twisted into evidence of greater crimes. The aim was not truth, but endurance, the wearing down of the will, until submission became the only imaginable escape. Ferdinand imported this logic into his marriages, turning the bedchamber into a tribunal of the heart. The effects were devastating. Servants whispered of queens who jumped at the sound of approaching boots, their hands trembling as though struck by an invisible lash. Some queens began to shake uncontrollably when summoned their bodies, reacting before their minds could command calm. Others developed the haunted stillness that psychologists now associate with trauma, faces, blank eyes staring at some distant point as though detaching from the present moment. These were symptoms we would now name as post-traumatic stress, born not on the battlefield, but in silken rooms where love had been weaponized. The unpredictability was key. A queen could prepare for physical pain, an illness, a confinement, even the humiliation of inspections, but she could not prepare for rules that shifted beneath her feet. Every day carried the dread that whatever she did might be wrong. The human mind faced with such a landscape narrows its field of survival. It ceases to ask, "What do I want?" and instead asks only, "What will keep me safe for one more hour?" That narrowing repeated day after day is how identity collapses, and Ferdinand knew it. His tests were not mistakes of temper but tools of domination. They forced his wives into a state of permanent vigilance, the same kind of hyper-alertness soldiers carried into the trenches or heretics carried into the chambers of inquisitors. Sleep became fragile, appetites withered, laughter disappeared. In its place grew a quiet, unrelenting fear that outlasted every banquet, every procession, every prayer. The cruel genius of these tests was that they left no marks on the skin, no evidence that could be shown to foreign courts or chroniclers. What they destroyed was internal, the steady erosion of courage, the silencing of voice, the breaking of the will. In time, queens ceased to resist, not because they agreed, but because they could no longer imagine resistance at all. This is what Ferdinand achieved through his impossible demands, a marriage where obedience was never enough, where fear became the constant companion of every hour, and where the very sound of footsteps in a corridor could unmake a woman. It was not merely cruelty, it was strategy, a calculated campaign of psychological warfare disguised as royal duty. At the core of Ferdinand's obsession lay the most chilling of his convictions that his wives were not people to be cherished, but instruments to be tested, measured, and replaced. Their value was calculated in heirs, and their bodies became laboratories for a grotesque form of dynastic science. Each marriage began with what Ferdinand called his production quotas, the expectation that within a precise span of months the queen must conceive. Failure to do so was not misfortune, it was dereliction of duty. The marriage bed was a workshop, and the queen was the experimental subject. Success was pregnancy, failure was betrayal. The methods applied to enforce these quotas were as cruel as they were absurd. Ferdinand monitored cycles with the precision of a bookkeeper demanding notes on bleeding days' mood changes, even the food consumed at supper. Meals were sometimes altered, according to superstition, more almonds for fertility, less fish for fear it cooled the womb. Queens were instructed in sleeping positions said to favour conception myths, borrowed from medieval medical texts that blended astrology, humours and folk belief into an authoritative-sounding doctrine. In this Ferdinand was not entirely alone. Across Iberia, aristocratic estates treated animal husbandry with similar calculation. Horses were bred for strength, bulls for virility, sheep for wool quality. Records survive of noble families tracking stallion lineages with obsessive care, charting traits across generations. Ferdinand's cruelty was to take this logic and apply it to his wives, reducing royal marriages to livestock experiments. One can almost hear the bureaucratic echo: mares must foal, queens must bear sons. Superstition fused seamlessly with pseudoscience. Learned men, some with university training, prescribed treatments that ranged from the merely bizarre to the outright torturous. Queens were ordered to drink concoctions of herbs believed to warm the womb, or wear amulets inscribed with prayers against barrenness. Astrologers were summoned to pinpoint favourable nights, while midwives whispered advice drawn from folklore: avoid certain foods, sleep beneath specific stars, or bathe in water blessed on saints' days. When these measures failed, blame fell not on the remedies but on the women themselves. The cruelty lay not just in the physical demands, but in the emotional stripping away of motherhood's natural intimacy. Pregnancy was treated not as a moment of joy, but as the fulfillment of a quota. A queen who carried a child did so under constant surveillance. Her diet regulated her movements, limited her sleep, monitored. Letters describe a queens who whispered to their unborn children in secret, afraid that even tender words might be judged as improper or superstitious. Imagine carrying life within you, and yet being forbidden to feel it as your own. This laboratory mindset was enshrined in policy. Reports on queen's fertility were filed alongside reports on wars and taxes. Fertility was not a private hope, it was a matter of state. Each womb was a political instrument, each failed pregnancy a national crisis, each miscarriage a suspected act of sabotage. Servants reported that queens sometimes begged God not merely for children, but for relief from the king's relentless scrutiny. Their prayers reveal the paradox: the longing for motherhood overshadowed by the terror of failing a test they never chose to take. Modern eyes can see clearly what Ferdinand's court could not or would not. His methods bore all the hallmarks of coercive control, amplified by the veneer of science and faith. They anticipated darker moments in history, when states would again treat human beings as subjects of experiment, justifying cruelty in the name of progress or stability. In Ferdinand's Spain, the laboratory was not a sterile hall, but the royal chamber, and the experiments were conducted not with chemicals, but with bodies and lives. For the queens, the lesson was brutal. They were not wives, not mothers, not sovereigns in their own right. They were vessels placed under the torchlight of inspection, their worth measured by what they could produce, their failures inscribed in ink and rumour. And every sigh, every miscarriage, every barren month became another entry in a ledger that reduced love life and dignity to the cold arithmetic of quotas. In Ferdinand's court, fertility was not merely a hope or a blessing, it was the bedrock of legitimacy, the linchpin of dynastic survival. To bear heirs was to secure Spain's throne, to fail was to imperil it. Within this warped logic, infertility was not a misfortune but a crime, and the accused inevitably were the queens themselves. Whenever months passed without pregnancy, suspicion sharpened into accusation. Ferdinand refused to consider chance nature or even his own body as possible explanations. Instead, he framed barrenness as betrayal. Queens who could not conceive were branded as saboteurs of the crown, accused of withholding heirs, as if they plotted the collapse of Spain itself. In whispered councils, words like treason and disloyalty were invoked not against generals or ministers, but against young women whose only crime was failing to bend biology to royal demand. This weaponization of infertility echoed broader patterns in Renaissance Europe. Across Christendom, women's bodies were treated as sites of suspicion. The witch trials that swept through Germany, France, and England often targeted women accused of spoiling crops or drying wombs, crimes that were little more than the projection of male anxiety about reproduction and inheritance. A barren marriage could be blamed on witchcraft in the blood or curses of the womb. The very rhythms of female biology, miscarriage, stillbirth, irregular cycles were reframed as evidence of dark conspiracies. Ferdinand's court magnified these fears into propaganda. Servants whispered that barren queens had secretly consumed herbs to block conception. Priests muttered that their suffering was divine punishment for hidden sins. Nobles speculated that they carried bloodlines cursed by wood. Such rumours were not idle chatter. They were tools of power. Each tale that spread through the palace corridors eroded the queen's standing, painting her not as an unfortunate victim of fate, but as a deliberate traitor to Spain's future. Imagine the weight of such accusations on a queen already crushed by surveillance and humiliation. Every miscarriage was scrutinized as if it had been chosen. Every delay in pregnancy was interpreted as defiance. Even her prayers could be twisted against her too fervent, and she was desperate. Too restrained, and she was careless. In such an environment, no woman could win. Her womb became both battlefield and courtroom, and the verdict was always waiting guilty. Other monarchies mirrored this cruelty. In Tudor England, Catherine of Aragon was cast aside by Henry VIII after years of miscarriages and stillbirths. Her failures used to justify the king's break with Rome. In France, Catherine de' Medici endured public scorn during her decade-long struggle to conceive, subjected to bizarre treatments that bordered on torture. Infertility was never considered a shared struggle. It was always the wife's fault, her body framed as the site of sin, sabotage, or weakness. But Ferdinand's system carried a uniquely punitive twist. Infertility became treason against the state. By branding queens as traitors, he transformed personal tragedy into political crime. It justified harsher confinement, increased surveillance, and the ultimate weapon replacement. A barren queen did not merely fail her husband. She failed Spain, failed Christendom, failed the will of God as interpreted by the crown. Such charges made her powerless to defend herself. Who could argue against a kingdom's survival? The propaganda seeped into every corner of the palace. Courtiers distanced themselves from barren queens, fearful of being tainted by association. Servants watched their words carefully, lest sympathy for their mistress be interpreted as rebellion. Even foreign ambassadors carried these accusations back to their courts, spreading the image of Ferdinand as the long-suffering king, cursed with disloyal wives. The cruelty here is twofold. The queen not only suffered the agony of repeated failure, but also bore the stigma of intentional sabotage. Grief was not permitted. Compassion was not extended. Instead, the women were made villains in the story of dynastic struggle, their pain erased by the accusation of treason. In this, Ferdinand's Spain reveals a larger truth about power. When rulers fear weakness, they will turn tragedy into crime and victims into scapegoats. Infertility in his hands became not a sorrow to be shared, but a weapon to destroy reputations, tighten control, and justify cruelty. His queen, stripped of dignity, became living cautionary tales, proof that in his kingdom, even the failure to bear life could mark a woman for death in life. When whispers of barrenness hardened into accusations of treason, Ferdinand devised a stage more degrading than any locked chamber, the tribunal. His queens, already humiliated by inspections, already shattered by endless availability, were sometimes forced to stand before panels of nobles and clergy compelled to defend the most private dimensions of their bodies as though they were criminals on trial. Imagine the setting: a hall lit by torches, banners of Spain's glory fluttering on the walls, a semicircle of men in robes and armour. At the centre, the queen draped in silk but trembling beneath the weight of every eye fixed upon her. Around her, priests with their solemn faces, noblemen with their records, physicians holding their notes. The questions were not about policy, diplomacy, or governance. They were about her womb. Have you resisted your duties to the king? Have you taken herbs to prevent conception? Have you sought charms, spells, or illicit remedies? Why has God not blessed you with an heir? These questions pierced like blades, reducing her identity as queen and woman to a single biological outcome. If she answered yes to anything, she damned herself. If she denied it, her very denials were logged as evidence of deceit. Just as in the Inquisition's interrogation chambers, truth mattered less than submission. The process was not about discovery. It was about breaking her spirit before witnesses, making her humiliation a performance of loyalty to the crown. Some tribunals summoned clergy to thunder about sin. They suggested that barrenness was divine punishment, that perhaps the queen harboured secret wickedness unworthy of royal blessing. Others summoned physicians to prod and probe with cold detachment, describing in detail her supposed failures as though presenting a cadaver. Nobles added their voices, reminding her that Spain's stability rested on her ability to bear children, that to fail was to risk rebellion war and the collapse of God's chosen order. In such moments, a queen was not simply interrogated. She was made the scapegoat for the anxieties of an entire realm. The parallels to witch trials are striking. Across Europe, women accused of sorcery were interrogated in the same way, asked impossible questions, condemned by their own words, damned if they confessed, damned if they denied. Both witch trials and Ferdinand's mock tribunals shared the same ritual logic. Women's bodies became repositories of suspicion, their suffering twisted into proof of guilt. Where witches were blamed for withering crops, queens were blamed for empty cradles. In both cases, the natural failures of life were reimagined as deliberate sabotage. Even the tone of questioning mirrored inquisitorial practice. Priests pressed the queen with the rhythm of endurance, the same question repeated, until exhaustion broke her resistance. Every silence was logged as evidence of guilt. Every protest was interpreted as evasion. The trial was never about fairness. It was about spectacle, about demonstrating to courtiers and clergy that even the queen was not beyond suspicion, that the king's will penetrated every boundary. For the queens, the ordeal left scars deeper than confinement. They were forced to speak of their bodies in public, to endure probing questions from men who wielded power over their reputations, their futures, even their survival. In those moments, they ceased to be sovereigns and became defendants stripped of dignity and recast as potential traitors. The very men who bowed to them in ceremony now demanded they explain their wombs like peasants hauled before a magistrate. What is perhaps most haunting is that these tribunals were rarely recorded in official archives. Unlike marriage contracts or treaties, they were events meant to intimidate, not preserve. They lived in whispers, ambassadors, writing cautious lines back to their homelands, servants recounting what they had glimpsed, rumours spilling across the palace. And yet the silence of the record only magnifies the cruelty, for it means that these queens were humiliated not only in life but erased in death. Their trials were never dignified with formal justice, only remembered as shadows of accusation. Here we see Ferdinand's mastery of psychological warfare at its zenith. By forcing queens to defend themselves in tribunals that could never acquit them, he shattered their sense of sovereignty and made their humiliation part of the machinery of rule. Just as witches burned to reinforce communal fear, queens stood accused to reinforce dynastic control. Both were performances of terror, reminding all who watched that no woman, no matter how high-born, could escape suspicion when power demanded a scapegoat. And so the tribunal hall became another chamber in Ferdinand's prison, of silk and stone. It was not the crackle of flames, but the crackle of parchment that consumed these women, their dignity sacrificed to a spectacle that called itself justice, but was in truth nothing more than cruelty and ceremonial dress. If the queen herself could not be fully broken by confinement, surveillance, or humiliation, Ferdinand had another weapon at hand: her folly. Royal marriages were never just unions between individuals. They were contracts binding entire dynasties, webs of obligation sealed with dowries, treaties, and bloodlines. To fail in her duties was not only to disappoint her husband, it was to imperil her father's prestige, her mother's dowry, her siblings' futures. Ferdinand understood this better than most, and he wielded it ruthlessly. When a queen failed to conceive, the punishment spread outward. Dowries were withheld, often in part, or entirely, leaving her natal family financially crippled. Promised lands or political concessions were suddenly revoked, with Ferdinand justifying the betrayal on the grounds that the bride's body had not delivered its promised heirs. Behind the language of law lay the unspoken cruelty. One woman's infertility became the excuse to penalise an entire kingdom. Foreign families lived in fear of this weapon. Ambassadors wrote home in careful phrases, warning that a barren queen's relatives might be accused of sending a cursed daughter, one whose womb was defective, or, worse, deliberately sabotaged by dark arts. In Catholic Spain, where superstition and faith blended seamlessly, such accusations were catastrophic. A noble house branded as carrying a curse could see its marriage prospects evaporate. Alliances were postponed, inheritance rights challenged, rumours clinging like smoke long after the original queen was gone. This was not without precedent. In the Habsburg world, where dynasties intermarried to the point of exhaustion, queens were frequently blamed for dynastic fragility. When Empress Maria Anna struggled to bear sons in the 17th century, whispers of defective bloodlines spread across courts. Earlier still, Tudor England revealed the same cruel logic. Catherine of Aragon, who endured repeated miscarriages in her marriage to Henry VIII, watched as her own Spanish lineage came under suspicion. Henry declared not only her marriage invalid, but her womb accursed, arguing before clerics that her barrenness was proof God opposed the union. Catherine's father, Ferdinand himself, was implicated. By extension, his daughter's failure became his dynasty's shame. Thus the queen's body became a bargaining chip twice over, once in her marriage and again as leverage against her family. The cruel brilliance of this tactic lay in its totality. A queen could not resist without knowing her defiance would cost her parents land, her brothers and sisters their futures, her entire bloodline its reputation. Even if she sought the strength to endure punishment herself, she was made complicit in the suffering of others. It is the oldest and most devastating form of coercion hostage-taking, not of bodies but of honour. In Ferdinand's Spain, these threats were sharpened by the religious and political climate. The Inquisition had already trained people to see curses, heresy, and divine punishment in every misfortune. To declare that a woman's barrenness was the fault of her family's bloodline was to brand them with something like spiritual treason. Foreign courts knew it too. Letters from Italy, France, and the Empire betray a nervous caution sending daughters to Spain meant risking not only their health, but the reputation of the entire dynasty. It is worth pausing here to consider the psychological cruelty of such leverage. Imagine a queen lying awake in her locked chamber, knowing her inability to conceive might cause her father to lose allies, her mother to be shamed, her siblings to lose betrothals. Her body was not only her prison, but her family's ransom note. She carried the weight of nations in her womb, and every empty month became another month of quiet catastrophe. Ferdinand's strategy reveals how dynastic politics amplified personal cruelty. A private marriage became a public battlefield, and queens were forced to live with the knowledge that their pain reverberated far beyond the palace walls. No tear was truly private, because each failure echoed in the halls of their fathers, brothers, and cousins abroad. This was Ferdinand's genius for domination. He found a way to make resistance unthinkable by ensuring that disobedience or even simple human frailty spread punishment outward to those a queen loved most. Her own suffering could perhaps be endured, but the destruction of her family's honour, that was unbearable. It was enough to silence even the faintest thought of rebellion. Thus queens lived not only as prisoners in silk and stone, but as unwilling executioners of their own bloodlines. Their silence, their compliance, their trembling obedience were not simply the result of fear for themselves, but of a terror far greater than knowledge that the lives and reputations of their families were shackled to every movement of their womb. When statecraft failed, when medicine faltered, Ferdinand turned to something darker, stranger, and in many ways more humiliating for his wives' superstition. Obsessed with heirs, yet unwilling to accept the role of chance, he sought certainty in the voices of experts, fortune-tellers, astrologers, and quack physicians, who promised that the secrets of fertility lay hidden in the stars, in the stomach, in the position of the bed. These were not harmless consultations. They became another form of domination, another theatre where queens were forced to participate in rituals that mocked both their dignity and their suffering. Ferdinand surrounded himself with a rotating court of oracles. Some were physicians trained in the medieval universities, armed with humoral theory and Latin phrases. Others were wandering mystics who promised miraculous cures or invoked saints to guarantee heirs. Astrologers charted horoscopes for the queen's womb, identifying auspicious nights when union was destined to yield a son. The king listened attentively, treating their pronouncements with the gravity of law, and then he enforced them, ensuring that the queen obeyed each instruction, no matter how degrading. The rituals ranged from the absurd to the torturous. Queens were ordered to wear amulets strung with herbs, their scent so strong they burned the skin beneath the chain. They were told to sleep with charms carved in ivory, or to swallow potions brewed from deer antler saffron or powdered pearls. Some were made to bathe in water blessed on saints' days, the bath scented with strange mixtures of animal fat and myrrh. Even sleeping positions became policy. Manuel's comms of the age instructed that the woman should lie on her left side after intercourse to conceive sons, on her right for daughters. Queens under Ferdinand's supervision were commanded to arrange themselves like statues held in place until attendants confirmed they had obeyed. The body's natural rhythms were denied. The queen was recast as a vessel whose every angle could be adjusted to produce the desired result. The humiliation was intensified by the presence of witnesses. Servants were instructed to ensure the queen consumed her potions, wore her charms, and held her position. Refusal was not an option. Resistance was equated with treason. What might have been whispered advice in another court became under Ferdinand another layer of bureaucratic enforcement. The queen's body was not her own. It was a site of constant experimentation, every superstition elevated into mandatory practice. This reliance on oracles was not unusual in Europe. In France, Catherine de' Medici endured years of fertility rituals before producing heirs, drinking strange syrups, submitting to invasive treatments, even consulting astrologers who prescribed union time to celestial alignments. In England, Elizabeth Woodville was accused of using witchcraft to secure her marriage to Edward IV, her fertility framed as supernatural manipulation. Across Christendom, women's wombs were imagined as porous to both medicine and magic, always subject to interference. But Ferdinand institutionalized what elsewhere remained private. His court recorded the rituals, kept notes on their effects, and punished queens for non-compliance. The blending of pseudoscience and superstition became a machinery of cruelty legitimized by the language of expertise. The oracles, eager for royal favour, amplified Ferdinand's paranoia. If the queen did not conceive, she must not have obeyed correctly. If she miscarried, she must have laughed at the wrong hour, prayed in the wrong posture, or failed to keep her amulet close. The victim was always guilty. For the queens, these rituals carried a special kind of torment. Not only did they strip away dignity, they mocked their very humanity. Forced to swallow concoctions that made them ill, to wear charms they despised, to submit to scrutiny. In their most private moments, they became both subject and object in a theatre of absurdity. Their pain was dismissed as superstition's collateral, their humiliation reframed as service to Spain. In truth, these oracles of cruelty offered Ferdinand what he wanted most: another tool of control. They gave him a language to disguise domination as destiny, abuse as science, humiliation as hope. And for the women who endured it, the rituals must have felt like a grim parody of faith. Sacred words twisted into instruments of shame, the promise of life transformed into another prison. Part 16. The Replacement System. Perhaps the most devastating element of Ferdinand's cruelty was not the humiliation of inspections or the torture of fertility rituals, but the certainty that every queen lived with, she was expendable. While they still breathed, while they still prayed for strength, Ferdinand was already preparing their successors. Marriage to him was not a sacred bond, but a contract with a built-in replacement clause. The system was astonishingly cold in its efficiency. Records from his court suggest that Ferdinand maintained lists, what modern historians have called bride databases. These were detailed files on princesses scattered across Europe, complete with notes on their dowries, political value, family alliances, and even rumoured fertility. One court secretary described them as inventories, the language one might use for landholdings or livestock. To Ferdinand, prospective wives were assets waiting to be acquired, of their worth calculated in coin and children. Negotiations for these replacements often began while the current queen was gravely ill or still fulfilling her duties under great suffering. Ambassadors were dispatched quietly to foreign courts, feeling out the willingness of other dynasties to provide a daughter. Letters exchanged between noble families discussed a queen's failing health in the same breath as the dowry of her successor. In some cases, Ferdinand even entertained visits from potential brides, while the queen was still alive, forcing the dying woman to watch her replacement walk the very halls she herself was confined to. This pattern had precedents across Europe. Monarchs from France to the Habsburg Empire routinely treated arranged marriages as weapons of power, forging and discarding alliances as needed. Henry VIII of England would later perfect the cruelty of discarding wives when they failed to produce sons. The French court under the Valois kings often treated queens as diplomatic placeholders. If one line faltered, another bride could be imported to shore up the throne. Yet Ferdinand's method was particularly chilling in its immediacy. Other rulers waited until death or annulment. He began the process while his queen still lived. The psychological warfare of this cannot be overstated. Queens knew that illness or infertility did not merely disappoint the king, it opened negotiations for their replacements. They could hear the whispers in corridors, the footsteps of foreign envoys arriving to discuss new alliances. Servants recorded instances of queens weeping at night not only from pain or exhaustion but from the sound of discussions taking place in the very rooms adjacent to theirs. In some cases, the dying queens were compelled to meet their potential replacements, a final act of humiliation that stripped them of dignity even in their last days. To Ferdinand, this was practical governance. The crown could not risk a break in succession, but to the women trapped in this machinery, it was a living death. They were forced to exist with the knowledge that their failure or simply their mortality did not matter. Their presence was provisional. Their worth expired the moment negotiations for a successor began. This replacement system also reinforced obedience. Queens who resisted, who wept too openly, who hesitated in fulfilling their duties were reminded subtly, or directly, that another bride was waiting. The database was not only a tool for diplomacy but a threat hovering constantly over their lives. It was the unspoken message you are replaceable, and the next woman is already chosen. In Ferdinand's Spain, marriage was not a partnership but a rotating office. The queen was a placeholder, her womb, a policy instrument, her life a fragile tenure awaiting its successor. No matter how resplendent the ceremonies, how ornate the gowns, or how solemn the vows, each bride entered the palace under the shadow of her own eventual replacement. Of all the cruelties Ferdinand devised, perhaps none cut deeper than the slow torture of forcing his queens to endure the presence of their successors while they still lived. It was not enough that they suffered inspection, humiliations, and rituals. They had to witness the machinery of their own replacement grinding forward before their eyes. Servants whispered of scenes almost unbearable to recount. A queen pale with fever, confined to her bed, would hear voices outside her chamber, diplomats murmuring about dowries, priests debating dispensations, secretaries drafting contracts for another bride. Sometimes the voices carried through the thin walls, sometimes the discussions happened deliberately close so the queen could hear every word. In this cruel theatre, even her dying breaths were overshadowed by negotiations for the woman who would inherit her crown. The most chilling reports describe queens compelled to meet their replacements. Imagine a frail woman propped on pillows, her body trembling as a young princess is ushered into her chamber under the guise of courtesy. The sick queen, her hair dulled by illness, looks into the eyes of the girl who will wear her jewels, occupy her rooms, and most painfully step into her marriage. For the successor it was a formality, for the queen it was a living death. The case of Maria Cristina is perhaps the most haunting. After multiple miscarriages, she is believed to have suffered what we would now call postpartum depression. Her body was ravaged, her spirit heavy with grief. Instead of compassion, Ferdinand began courting foreign families, openly seeking a new wife, even as Maria Cristina still reeled from her losses. Courtiers reported that she could hear the negotiations through the very walls of her confinement. She sat alone, surrounded by silks that mocked her emptiness, listening as her future was dismantled piece by piece. To be alive yet already erased, that was Ferdinand's final cruelty. This practice reveals the stark expendability of women in dynastic politics. Across Europe, queens were valued not for themselves, but for what they could produce. If they bore sons, they were celebrated. If they failed, they were discarded. Catherine of Aragon in England was set aside after 2 decades of service because her body could no longer deliver heirs. Catherine de' Medici endured years of ridicule before she conceived her worth hanging by a thread. Queens were not wives in the modern sense. They were state property, and their value had an expiration date. But Ferdinand weaponized this logic with unprecedented precision. By forcing queens to witness their own replacement, he broke them twice once, through humiliation and again through erasure. Death was no release when life itself became a rehearsal for absence. These women did not merely fear failure, they feared the spectacle of being replaced while still breathing, their dignity stripped away in the most intimate of defeats. Culturally, this practice underscored the brutal reality of royal marriage in the late medieval and early modern world. Women's bodies were political tools and their individuality mattered little. Dynasties traded daughters as one trades coin or land, and kings like Ferdinand ensured that no queen could ever forget her disposability. The message was cruelly clear. You are not irreplaceable, you are not permanent, you are not sovereign, you are a vessel, and vessels can be exchanged. And so queens lay in their beds, frail and trembling, listening to the voices that heralded their end. Some turned inward, praying to saints for a dignity their husbands denied them. Others wept quietly, their tears absorbed into the pillows that had so often betrayed them to the inspectors. They died not only of illness, but of the crushing knowledge that their lives had already been erased by the woman waiting just outside their door. If there remained a final cruelty Ferdinand could devise, it was this forcing his queens to participate in their own erasure, as if the endless inspections, humiliating rituals, and suffocating surveillance were not enough. Some queens were compelled to write letters of recommendation for the very women who would replace them. Picture the scene. A queen weakened by illness or grief is handed parchment and quill. Courtiers stand nearby, their faces carefully neutral, while the king's secretary dictates the phrases, gracious words about a foreign princess's virtue, piety and suitability as a wife. Each word the queen writes is another thread in the rope pulling her from her throne. She dips the quill in ink, her hand trembling, and writes not from conviction, but from compulsion. It is a ritual of surrender, her dignity reduced to the strokes of a pen. The psychological cruelty here is profound. To be replaced is one kind of pain. To be forced to bless the replacement is another. It is complicity under duress, a coerced endorsement that deepens the wound. In that moment, the queen ceases to be merely a victim, she is made into an accomplice in her own undoing. This is the genius of oppressive regimes. They do not simply destroy, they make the condemned participate in their destruction, hollowing the spirit as well as the body. History offers haunting parallels. In the Spanish Inquisition, accused heretics were sometimes forced to confess sins they had not committed, compelled to testify against themselves so that their execution could be justified. In Stalinist Russia, political prisoners wrote false confessions praising the party even as they were marched to their deaths. In Nazi concentration camps, prisoners were made to participate in degrading rituals, stripping themselves of humanity before the regime finished the job. The logic was always the same. Power is complete only when it can force the victim to kneel and affirm the very structure that crushes them. For Ferdinand's queens, the act of writing these letters was a symbolic death before the real one. It told them and everyone watching that their sovereignty had been completely stripped away. No longer could they even claim the silent dignity of resistance. Instead, their last official act was to recommend the woman who would step into their place as though the crown itself had always belonged to the system rather than to them. The humiliation did not end with the act of writing. These letters were circulated through diplomatic channels, read aloud in foreign courts, and used as proof of Spain's magnanimity. See, Ferdinand could say even the departing queen affirms the worth of her successor. What was in truth a coerced act of despair became propaganda, strengthening his legitimacy while silencing hers. Psychologically, the queens must have felt the annihilation of self. The last fragments of autonomy, voice, choice, the ability to refuse were taken from them. To resist was treason, to comply was to confirm their own expendability. They were trapped in the cruel paradox that defines coercive control at its apex. Whether you resist or obey, the outcome is the same, but obedience ensures you carry the added shame of having helped it along. This final humiliation is perhaps the purest expression of Ferdinand's tyranny. He did not want merely to dominate his queens' bodies. He wanted to colonize their minds. He sought not just heirs, but submission. Not just compliance, but complicity. It was not enough that they die in silence. He demanded that they bless the hand that struck them down. In this, Ferdinand's cruelty transcended the personal and became symbolic of the age. The queen, once the radiant emblem of alliance and hope, reduced to a secretary of her own replacement. It is a scene as grotesque as it is unforgettable, and it marks the ultimate descent from sovereignty to servitude. The suffering inflicted on Ferdinand's queens did not stop at the threshold of their chambers. It seeped outward, staining the very fabric of the court. Trauma once born in private has a way of leaking into corridors, kitchens, and council halls. By the end of Ferdinand's reign, the Spanish court itself had become a haunted place where silence pressed as heavily as the tapestries on the walls, and where every servant, scribe, and noble lived in the shadow of the king's bedroom rules. Servants bore the brunt of it. The young women ordered to carry stained sheets to inspectors, the chamberlains forced to lift fainting queens into the king's chamber, the scribes commanded to record humiliating details in the archives. They became unwilling participants in rituals of cruelty. Many developed their own forms of dread. Some scribes wrote with trembling hands, careful not to omit a detail that might later be judged as falsification. Maids whispered prayers before entering the queen's room as though walking into a confessional. One chronicler noted that a laundress refused to sleep in the palace at night, claiming that the walls carried whispers she could no longer endure. The courtiers too were caught in the web. Those who witnessed the tribunals or heard the cries of queens behind locked doors learned to lower their voices to avoid speaking of what they saw. A culture of silence settled like fog. Conversations ended abruptly. when a new figure entered the room. Gossip survived only in half-sentences, coded gestures, or rumours carried on journeys to distant estates. But even silence left its mark. Courtiers began to speak of the palace as a place of shadows, a house where laughter had gone to die. Yet gossip inevitably found ways to escape. Ambassadors reported troubling rumours back to their homelands, stories of fainting queens, of bedsheets turned into evidence of foreign princesses terrified at the prospect of a Spanish marriage. These whispers undermined Ferdinand's diplomatic efforts. Some noble families once eager to ally with Spain began to hesitate. One Italian ambassador noted that noble households in Milan and Florence quietly discouraged their daughters from being considered for the Spanish throne, preferring obscurity to humiliation. In France, mothers warned their daughters in hushed tones, better a convent than a Spanish crown. The trauma spread through the ranks of nobility as well. Families who had married their daughters into Ferdinand's system lived with regret, watching helplessly as their daughters wasted away in isolation. Others, who lost political leverage by refusing Spain's offers, still counted themselves fortunate to have spared their children the ordeal. Over time, the Spanish court developed a reputation not of splendour but of dread. Its palaces might glitter in daylight, but at night they seemed haunted by whispers of suffering. Even those untouched directly by Ferdinand's rules could not escape the atmosphere. Pages and guards wrote in later years of the eerie quiet that hung over the royal apartments, a stillness broken only by weeping behind heavy doors. Visitors remarked on the stiffness of ceremony, the absence of joy in festivals, the hollow echo of prayers in chapels that seemed to hold no comfort. Trauma, though invisible, had become institutional. The long-term effects were corrosive. By traumatizing his wives, Ferdinand traumatized the court that served them. By humiliating queens, he instilled fear in nobles who should have been his strongest allies. The very system he built to secure Spain's future instead bred unease, resentment and distrust. In the end, the court of Ferdinand II was not remembered as a place of glory, but as a place of shadows, a palace where cruelty seeped into the mortar, where silence was safer than truth, and where every servant carried memories they dared not speak. It was not just the queens who were broken. It was the court itself, fractured by complicity, burdened with secrets, and scarred by the knowledge that power in Spain was not only absolute, it was merciless. What Ferdinand created inside his palaces was not simply a private pathology, it was a system. His bedroom rules were not the eccentricities of a cruel husband, but the codified practices of a king who believed domination could be written into the fabric of governance. What happened to his queens was not hidden disorder, but state-sponsored abuse documented in archives, sanctioned by clergy, legitimized by tradition, and carried out in the name of Spain's stability. From the wedding night inspections to the mock trials of barren wives, every ritual spoke the same truth. Compassion had no place in his conception of power. Love, intimacy, and even grief were stripped of humanity and transformed into matters of policy. To Ferdinand, women's bodies were not companions in sovereignty, but instruments of succession laboratories, of experiment and symbols to be manipulated. He elevated suspicion to law and humiliation to tradition, and in doing so revealed how monarchy at its most paranoid can become indistinguishable from tyranny. The echoes stretch far beyond his reign. The surveillance of intimacy forcing private acts into public evidence foreshadows the modern state's obsession with monitoring its citizens. The dehumanization of women, reducing them to wombs and quotas, reflects a pattern seen in every patriarchal system that has sought to disguise cruelty as duty, and the logic of coercive control-breaking spirit through impossible demands, silencing resistance by threatening families remains recognizable in abusive relationships and authoritarian regimes alike. There is a temptation to imagine monsters obvious, to place them in dungeons, on battlefields and torture chambers. But Ferdinand's legacy reminds us that monsters often wear crowns. They preside over courts draped in silk, they smile in portraits, they invoke God and destiny, while orchestrating suffering behind closed doors. Their cruelty is not hidden in shadows, but woven into rituals, parades and laws, so that it appears to be order itself. For the queens who lived and died under Ferdinand's rules, the palace was both prison and siege. They endured humiliation that left no bruises but scarred the soul. Their pain was a lesson then, and it remains one now when power divorces itself from compassion, when intimacy becomes another arena for domination, when human beings are reduced to instruments of policy. Cruelty ceases to be accidental. It becomes systemic, and so history whispers its warning through their silence. Sometimes the greatest horrors are not shouted but signed into record. Sometimes tyranny is not enforced with swords but with ink and keys turned in locks. And sometimes the monster is not lurking in a dungeon at all. He is seated on a throne, smiling as the machinery of his cruelty ticks on around him. Lessons from a cruel bedchamber. The story of Ferdinand II's bedroom rules is more than a grim footnote in royal history. It is a mirror reflecting what happens when power severs itself from compassion, when authority consumes intimacy, and when human beings are reduced to tools of policy. Though the details belong to the Renaissance, the lessons are timeless. The first lesson is about the dangers of unchecked power. Ferdinand was not merely a husband, he was a king shielded from accountability and surrounded by institutions that sanctified his will. This is the natural breeding ground for abuse. History reminds us that when no one dares to question authority, cruelty is not an aberration, it becomes procedure. In our own lives, this warns us about the importance of accountability, whether in governments, workplaces, or families. Power without boundaries will always drift toward domination. The second lesson concerns the surveillance of intimacy. Ferdinand's inspections and humiliations turned the private realm into stages for political theatre. While we may no longer live in palaces where sheets are inspected at dawn, we inhabit a world where technology has blurred the line between public and private. Social media data collection and constant monitoring raise the same question: how much of ourselves are we willing to surrender to scrutiny? The Queens remind us of the cost of losing privacy when the most human aspects of our lives become evidence for others to judge. Third, the story exposes the dehumanization of women. For Ferdinand, queens were not companions but vessels for heirs. Their bodies were managed, measured, and replaced when they failed to meet quotas. Across centuries, women have endured similar logic, judged for fertility, silenced in their pain, valued only when they produce. Today, though much has changed, echoes remain in subtle biases that reduce women to roles rather than people. The lesson here is to resist all systems, personal or cultural, that deny the full humanity of women. Another lesson lies in the weaponization of fear. Ferdinand coerced obedience not only through direct cruelty, but by threatening the Queen's families and ensuring their compliance by expanding their suffering outward. This mirrors how abusive systems work even now. Fear spreads in ripples, silencing not just individuals but entire communities. It reminds us of the need to break cycles of silence to create cultures where speaking truth does not endanger loved ones. Finally, Ferdinand's story teaches us about resilience and memory. Though his queens were silenced, their suffering has not vanished. It lingers in archives, in rumours, in the quiet horror recorded by those who dared to whisper. Memory itself becomes resistance. By telling their stories, we honour them and learn to recognise cruelty in all its disguises. The haunting truth is that monsters do not always hide in shadows. Sometimes they sit on thrones, smile in portraits, or cloak themselves in duty. The task of every generation is to look beyond the mask, to insist that power must be tempered by compassion, and to defend the dignity of the human spirit even in the most private of spaces. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.